Hello, everyone! Welcome to Dropping Your Armour, where we listen to stories from thinkers, doers, and dreamers in the hope of unlocking our infinite human potential. My name is Neha, I'm an organizational psychologist, and I'm the host of this podcast. But today, I'm handing over my hosting privileges to Dr. Joachim Stempfle, who also goes by Joe. He's a psychologist by training and the founder of A-Train, and if you've tuned in before, you might remember him from previous episodes. Most recently, he had a conversation with Dr. Paul Gilbert on how to create a more compassionate world. And just as a side note, if you haven't heard that one, I'd highly recommend it. It's a really good one. Anyway, while that conversation dove deep into the neuropsychological basis of compassion, it also briefly touched on the philosophy of Buddhism. And this is what we want to explore further in today's Spotlight episode. So, we asked our brilliant and dear colleague Maurice Jonquet, who is a practicing Mahayana Buddhist, to illuminate how we can apply the spiritual teachings to our lives in the modern world. I hope you enjoy this conversation and have fun.
Good. Well, welcome everybody to our podcast, and I'm really excited about this conversation with my colleague Maurice, who is a Buddhist and has been practicing Buddhism for a long time. And we're going to talk about Buddhist philosophy and how it might help us in today's world deal with some of the things we all are dealing with. And Maurice, as you're the expert, really, you're the Buddhist. So I would ask you, can you tell us a little bit about the story of the Buddha and the essence of what Buddhist philosophy is?
For sure, Joe. Happy to be here and happy to have this conversation with you. I think the essence of Buddhism is captured quite well in the story of the Buddha. The Buddha was a prince, heir to the crown, right? And throughout his early years, childhood, teenage years, he was basically showered with gifts and everything, all sorts of material things, right? And protected from all sorts of suffering. And this was the case because the king received this sort of premonition or message when the Buddha was born that either his son will be a great spiritual leader or a fantastic king. And this king was more inclined towards material success, tried to steer off the Buddha in the direction of material gain, right? Of being a king. So he more or less protected him from seeing anything basically that could steer him off into the spiritual direction. So as a result, the Buddha never left the palace. This was not allowed. He was also quite detached from the nature of things, right? Always growing up in this sort of bubble. But once he asked his servants to take him, through a trip during the village, and through this trip, he encountered many things. He encountered, for example, a person who was sick, another person who was very old and fragile, and he also encountered a corpse. And he was very surprised because this is not what he had seen so far in the palace in his bubble, right? And he started this process of inquiry. What is going on with people? What is going on with life? Why do these things exist, basically? And just by asking these key questions, he was steered completely towards the spiritual side, towards this side of investigation of suffering and in the end of alleviation of suffering, right? So he picked up everything, left, and started off training with at the time, this were the ascetics, which were the spiritual masters of the region and the time. And he contemplated a lot until he reached this, let's call it an impasse between the current philosophies of the time and his own personal view of things, which was precisely related with suffering, right? Asceticism was a very rough practice. Ascetic masters would punish their body a lot and their mind because their view was that spirituality was the opposite of pleasure. So the more work you put in avoiding sensual pleasure, then the more spiritual you'll be, right? And this was a little bit conflictive with the way the Buddha saw things. So the Buddha realized that this was also an extreme, right? Asceticism was an extreme of spiritual practice. And the other extreme of sensual pleasure was just as damaging. So his proposal was that things should always be in balance, in the middle. So what he started practicing and teaching was called the middle way. And um, through this middle way, one should try not to intensify their suffering, but also not to run away from it. So it's a very sober look at the reality of things and how to live life, basically.
Yeah, that's also what I really like about Buddhist philosophy. You can just see the empathy that the Buddha had, the overwhelmedness with the suffering that he saw in people, but then the very practical, right, trying to understand what's behind it and trying to alleviate suffering, right, the compassion that shines through in already the Buddha's own experience is so powerful, and the human centeredness, right? It's not an academic; it's a much more down to earth, understanding what causes suffering and how can we help people relieve it. And can you maybe also, from your point of view, right, Buddhism differentiates a lot between pain versus suffering. What is that for you in essence? That difference?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So in Buddhism, we differentiate pain and suffering because we believe that certain things in life are inevitable. We really have little control over the external factors. And this is the whole point of Buddhism, right? Don't try to control what's going on outside. You have much more control and power over what happens inside. So the external factors, external situations bring pain. Old age brings pain, sickness brings pain, loss brings pain. These things we cannot control. They will just happen. But what we can control is the internal mechanisms that respond to whatever it is that happens around us. And these internal mechanisms um, can either bring suffering or can bring more sober and tranquil states of mind. And this depends on how you train the mind and what you focus on, what you feed, essentially. So
Yep.
there's this analogy in Buddhism called the second arrow, which actually talks about this. And um, it explains the story of this person that is walking through the forest, basically. And there's an archer hiding in the trees somewhere in the forest, and this archer shoots an arrow at him, right? And pierces through its leg or its arm. And then this person is so shocked that it just stays there still. And then the archer has a second go at it and shoots a second arrow, basically. And in this analogy, pain is the first arrow. It's inevitable. You don't see it coming, and even if you do, you cannot do much to stop it. But the second arrow is completely avoidable. And this is what in Buddhism we refer to as suffering, which is a reaction of the mind. You
Yeah.
can either stay and suffer and hold on to that, or you can move past it skillfully.
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful metaphor, the arrow metaphor, right? That for this statement by a Buddhist teacher, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, right? Suffering is how we deal with things in our mind, and looking at the sources of suffering around, so wanting to hold on to things that cannot be held on to, or trying to avoid something that cannot be avoided, right? That our mind tries to control the uncontrollable a lot. And can you maybe also share a little bit more about the sources of suffering, right? According to Buddhist philosophy, how does our mind create suffering?
Yeah, that's also a very interesting question because usually I find that people are a little bit confused about what creates suffering. Usually we put our faith completely on the outside, on the external factors, and we think, if I had this or that, or if I had this job, or when I graduate, maybe I'll be happy and there won't be any suffering in my life. So we put all our money into this bed. And usually what happens is we gain whatever it is that we were after, and then we're disappointed because suffering is still there and we're not fundamentally happy. Once the initial excitement of whatever it is that happened wanes, then we're left again with whatever it is that we had prior to this. So according to Buddhism, this is not very wise. So the real causes of suffering are in the mind, essentially, and we can scrutinize this. So in Buddhism, we should always investigate and see if the teaching is actually true. And if we think, for example, of a mind that is very peaceful, very tranquil, then that mind will be very difficult to disturb, right? Even if the external factors are a bit chaotic and there's a lot going on, this mind will remain at peace. And the opposite is also true. If you have a mind that is very turbulent, very conflictive, that has a lot of anger, then this person will be probably very difficult to satisfy. And it doesn't matter if everything is perfect around them, they'll still be uncomfortable, irritated, they'll still enter into conflict. So by looking at things this way, we can discover that actually the causes of suffering and also the causes of happiness, they come from the mind. And in Buddhism, we think that there's three main causes of suffering. So every time that we've experienced suffering in this life, it has come from these three things, essentially. One of them is delusion. So we are confused about the nature of things, like in this example. Another is attachment. We tend to cling to the things that provide pleasant experiences. We don't want our pleasant experiences to end, basically, which also feeds to delusion because we're unaware that things are impermanent. So this is also not very wise behavior. And the third poison is aversion, or sometimes we call it hate. We try to repel the things that we don't like, which is also unwise because, as we were saying towards the beginning of the conversation, we really have little control over the outside factors, right?
Absolutely. And what I love about Buddhist philosophy is how it really converges with also modern neuropsychology and psychology. So, for example, this desire, right, this attachment to things that we want to keep and preserve, and that we think we have to achieve certain things to be happy. Modern neuropsychology talks about hedonic adaptation, that whatever you get, it's 5 minutes later it becomes normal, and the pleasure is very short lived, right? So striving for material things gives you a very short boost, if you will, of happiness, and right there the disappointment sets in, that it doesn't make you fundamentally happy about your life, right? It's just a short-lived kind of peak. And similarly with avoidance piece, that right, trying to avoid harm, or moving away from negative things. I find it very interesting, the research that looks at, for example, a couple months after an event, the person who won the lottery and the person who had basically a spinal atrophy and lost its ability to walk report the same happiness level a couple months later. So they adapt to the circumstance, and we so try to avoid the negative things. They can't be avoided in many cases, right? But we will anyways. Our body will find a way to deal with it. So I really like how things come together in these philosophies. And I guess another very interesting question: why is this so relevant now? Why is this ancient wisdom in our day and age more relevant than ever?
Yeah, and that is a very relevant question because right now the state of the world could be better, right? And this also links to Buddhism in the sense that in Buddhism we don't think that the mind and the external factors are separate things. So there's a lot of misinterpretation about this element in the West. Many people then interpret this as, you know what, if I think about certain things, then they'll materialize. So maybe, if I have positive thoughts, then good things will happen to me. And if I avoid negative thoughts, then, I won't suffer. And this is incorrect because it produces the opposite effect. We get attached to things and we try to be averse of others. What Buddhism means or when it says that the mind and the external elements are not separate, is that whatever it is that appears in the mind will then translate into our action through our intention, basically. And if our intention is an intention driven by the causes of suffering, then our actions will materialize in actions that generate suffering for us and for those around us. But if our intention is one of alleviation of suffering, then the actions that we generate will produce this effect. And this also has a compounded effect. So we carry this through generations, basically. Um, you know, and I think maybe we can talk about this also, Joe, about generational trauma, for example, or things that we inherited
Absolutely.
from, our grandparents or even further, in the past. We generate this intention that was once theirs, and we keep on making a mess of things. So I think it's relevant for today, because when we shift our focus inwards and when we discover that it is our intention that has been driving all the problems that we're experiencing today, we gain back the power of changing that. And it takes a while, I think. If we have this discovery now, it will take some generations to produce a visible effect. But the longer we wait, then the more we will keep, for example, destroying the planet, or creating a lot of the problems that we experience nowadays in society or internationally. I think when we shift the focus inwards, and if we do that with a compassionate intent, then that will transform not only us, but also those around us.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. These cascades of suffering that often, right, you can see when people feel stressed themselves, then some of the reactions we might engage in to basically protect ourselves, right? Essentially ego-driven reactions where we might get very aggressive, or we might get very controlling, or we might try to avoid difficult topics, but then it always has an impact on others, right? So the suffering we try to avert with the ego-based reaction, I call it often the autopilot, right? An impulsive reaction inadvertently creates suffering on others, right? If I come home really tired and stressed, and I'm not even open to speak to my children, that creates an impact on them again, right? So you have a ripple effect, and you inadvertently create suffering in others through your own actions, right? And I also am quite inspired with some of the thinking that Buddhist philosophy also says you also create an imprint in your mind, right? So if you do an action, an ego-driven action, basically, to try to avoid something, or you're trying to control something, you're more likely to do that again, right? This is where it comes back with neuroscience, that you create neural pathways that you're more likely to execute the same pathways in the future. So you have an impact on yourself, right? That you train your brain in a certain way, but you also have an impact on others. And I think one of the pieces that are really important, right, with everything that's going on in the world, how do we train our mind to become more still and quiet so that we can get even to a point of true intention, right, where it's not just our ego, but our true self that basically drives the intention. I love the metaphor of the sea, right? Sometimes, in Buddhism, I've heard, people speak about the mind being like the sea. And if the sea is disturbed because there's so many things you're worrying about, and there's so many triggers that are triggering your mind to go in this direction, that direction, you never see clearly, right? You never see clearly what your true intention is. Essentially, right? The question is, who is answering? Who is deciding right now? Is it your true self, or is it your triggered ego that is trying to run away from something, is scared, right? And how do you calm the mind to a point of true intention? Seems to be very relevant in a day and age where there is just a lot of things you could possibly worry about, simply looking at the external environment, the war, the uncertainty. Seems to be more relevant than ever. I'm curious also, Maurice, the topic of compassion is a very important one in Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, but also increasingly we use it in the business world. How would you link compassion to Buddhism?
Yeah, well, compassion is Buddhism. If you analyze both, you will see that there really is little difference. So in Buddhism, compassion has two elements, and I think also in psychology. So maybe you can add to this, Joe. But in Buddhism, compassion has, first of all, the element of acknowledging that suffering is there, recognizing that there's suffering in us and suffering around us. And the second element is generating the desire that that suffering is alleviated. That turns into action. So it's not just about wishing that everyone's well, but it's rather turning it into action also, and helping others is important. And this is essentially the teaching of the Buddha. If you zoom in these two elements, you will see that the first piece, the acknowledgement of suffering, is the first noble truth. So the Buddha teaches that suffering exists, that suffering is real. And maybe you'll tell me, well, I don't need the Buddha to tell me that suffering is real. I'm well aware. I suffer all the time. Um, but the type of suffering that the Buddha means with this truth is not the suffering of the present. So it's not our current anxiety or worry or fear. Um, the Buddha speaks of suffering in the future. Um, and precisely because the causes of suffering are in the mind, right? And if we keep on trying to shift external factors to not suffer, then we never address the true causes of our suffering. So we need to acknowledge that suffering exists in the future because the causes of it are inside the mind, which is the second noble truth. The causes of suffering are inside the mind. And then the third and the fourth is basically turn into the alleviation of that suffering has a cessation, and that you should practice whatever it is that alleviates suffering. And this is basically compassion. So if you look at it this way, you'll see that compassion and Buddhism, it's impossible to separate them. Buddhism is an
Yeah.
act of compassion.
Yeah.
First of all,
Yeah.
self-compassion, and then once the mind is quiet, and once I have knowledge of myself and how to alleviate my own suffering, then I can turn around and help others. But before I do that, how can I alleviate the suffering elsewhere if I don't know how to alleviate suffering at all, right?
And that's the piece that really inspires me about Buddhism, that it is not a purely egocentric kind of, you do it to practice things so that you feel better, right? Where it's just about yourself, but it is a very much a focus also on others, right? That you alleviate also suffering in others, and compassion being the intention to do so, right? First of all, the intention to see the suffering when it's there, to not close your eyes, right, to it. It's easy to avoid difficult topics, or to avoid others' pain. So be there, be strong enough to deal with it, and then the desire to actually do something about it, right? The intent, and that's something I very much like about Buddhist philosophy. And yeah, I think there's some interesting work in the domain of spiritual materialism, right? Where some Buddhist scholars would argue that Buddhist practices, meditation, might be practiced by non-Buddhists more in a ego-driven way. I'm basically practicing meditation so that I feel better, right? And if that's it, then that's basically spiritual materialism. You're using spirituality just like you're using anything else for your own ego purposes alone, right? Just so you feel better. And what you're saying, though, is right, that Buddhist philosophy at its heart says you want to relieve suffering first in yourself. There might be a healing that needs to take place, right? If you're in a deranged mind status, you might not be able to help anyone else, right? So you might need to do the practice for yourself first, and self-compassion is key, but that's not where it stops, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then the focus should shift outside, to the suffering in others, and the impact and the contribution you might have there.
Absolutely. But I think the shift happens naturally. So even if you're practicing for selfish reasons, because you want to alleviate your own suffering, once you develop up to a certain point, you realize that you're not separate from other people. So even if you have reached, this tranquil states of mind, and you are enjoying a lot of inner peace, then if your mom is suffering, if your dad is suffering, if your partner is suffering, if your friends are suffering, they will be very quick to pull you into their also, turbulent states of mind. So also, even if you manage to help your close circle, the world around you will still be a mess. So there really is no point in stopping with your own development, because then you'll never really know true peace. You might know it for a few minutes when you're meditating and when you're isolated at home, but the moment you step out of the world, you will be slapped by all of this suffering, which is precisely the story of the Buddha, right? That's actually the teaching that we can get from his narrative, that even if everything is amazing at home, the moment you step out into the world, you will see that things need to change. And we need more leaders that can see this, that can basically acknowledge the suffering around them, and then can dedicate their lives and their work to alleviate that.
And I think you're mentioning a really important point, right? When you're a monk or a scholar, it might be easier to keep a tranquil mind, because you might not be hit as a monk in a monastery. You probably are not hit with so many things that you need to deal with every day, right? But when you're choosing more a practitioner's path or a warrior's path, you every day need to deal with tons of things that have the potential stress you out, right? To capture your mind completely. So I think another piece that I very much appreciate about Buddhist philosophy is this notion of disciplined practice. That this you have to have practices that you use no matter what to calm the mind, to reflect, right, to reach a more tranquil state. And if you stop, right, if you don't put these pieces in place continuously, you're always at risk, right? Your mind is always at risk to be disturbed, deranged, and that discipline that comes with it seems to be a very important element.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, Joe, because in the Buddhist community, there is an ongoing debate of whether or not the monastics have made a mistake of isolating themselves in communities, of isolating themselves in temples, and basically, or essentially keeping this knowledge and wisdom to themselves. Because in the end, they are also affected, you know. For example, we have seen um, a lot of monastics fleeing from Tibet and now going to other cities. They were also affected. So inside the Buddhist community, there's also this acknowledgement that it is impossible to separate yourself from others. In the end, you're all part of a bigger system. And if you ignore that, you will be fine for a while. But even if you're a monk inside your own bubble, reality will come for you, essentially. So it is really essential that we work together collectively to lift our level of consciousness. And that is the ultimate goal of Buddhism, essentially, at least of Mahayana Buddhism, which is very much involved with other people. In Buddhism, you have two main branches: Theravada Buddhism, which is a little bit more focused on yourself, and then Mahayana, which is always in the service of others. And in the Mahayana branch, we are very much aware of the systemic view of things. It's impossible to isolate anything. It is all connected, essentially.
Yeah, and I've always been drawn so much more to the Mahayana side, right? Because there is a lot to do in this world. And I think the challenges that also our children will be facing when you look at climate change and you look at all the big, the violence in this world, and all the other challenges, the inequality, there is simply a lot to do, not just on a grand scale, but, everyone has, right, a role to play, and we're all impacting people advertently or inadvertently. And that's why I love very much this notion that you have to be in this world, but not of this world only, right? That you're operating in this world, but if you're operating consciously and deliberately, you can add something to this world that is more than just your own material gain or your own physical well-being, right? There is a bigger impact to be had, and maybe that's a good bridge into, let's look at some applications, right, of Buddhist philosophy, how it might be helpful in today's very real world, right? So maybe the first interesting bit would be, personal resilience and personal growth. How can it help us there?
And I think that's a great question. From the point of view of resilience, I think um, it is important not only, in the grand scale of things, when we look at our piece in this whole system, but also personally. It's important to be able to hold that space in our own mind. This is where the study of suffering and the study of the alleviation of suffering take place. So usually we are also attached and averse to pleasant and unpleasant emotions. So every time we feel anger, for example, we just want to shake it off. We just want to stop being angry, basically. If we're sad, it's the same attitude. We maybe, I don't know, we call a friend, we go to the movies, we get ice cream, we do whatever we want to get this sadness out of the way, and we don't hold the space for us to explore and to discover where is this sadness coming from and how can I alleviate it without the need of, again, moving external things. So I think the resilience piece is a first step in really discovering for ourselves how can we alleviate our own suffering. And once we know how to hold the space for ourselves and how to alleviate our own suffering, we can extend that to other people. I see a lot of leaders jumping into action really quickly, firefighting mode, right? Trying to solve things. And more often than not, even though their intention is good, they create a bigger problem because they don't know how to help. They haven't helped themselves yet. So this resilience piece, building it and using it is absolutely important.
And I think you mentioned something really important, this when we try to avoid negative emotions, right? We create a lot of action that leads us away from ourselves and leads us away from the truth, leads us away from others, right? So one practice we sometimes use, right, also when we have leaders and groups discussing difficult topics, is this sitting with tension, where you sit with an emotion rather than pushing it away. And there's an interesting, it's not actually a Buddhist philosophy background, but more an Arabic background, the poem by Rumi, who talks about thoughts and emotions as guests in the house, and how can you welcome them all, right? And some are pleasant and some are unpleasant. Some guests are ugly, some are pretty, right? And the idea is that you welcome them all and you don't push any out. And as you welcome them, and you sit with them and you practice that, just that inner spaciousness to allow the emotion to be, it will naturally find its place, and it might even evaporate, right? Because emotions can be very fleeting, but this desire to always feel good and to avoid any kind of negative emotion might prevent us from getting really true to the more fundamental questions. And I also feel like it might prevent us from getting really close to other people and their suffering, right? If we're unable to engage in a negative emotion when they feel sad, right? If we're unable to feel that sadness ourselves, how are we going to help build that bridge at the end of the day, right? So I like that point around the spaciousness and the sitting, allowing the emotion, sitting with attention rather than just trying to push it away.
Exactly. And I think there's two pieces to what you're saying, Joe. One is, of course, the spaciousness and the resilience itself, but another is maybe one of the most profound teachings of the Buddha, and that is that everything that appears in the mind needs to cease and to disappear also. And this is something that we don't know. We think that we need to address the things that appear in the mind. We are jumping into action too quickly. We are unaware that if we just sit with our sadness for enough time, it will surely disappear. It needs to go away. So sometimes the wisest thing to do is, we call it in Buddhism, to retreat, not do anything. If you have a hot head, don't jump into action. You'll make it worse. If you're very sad, if you're out of energy, you don't need to push yourself either. So knowing when to retreat is also an essential part of Buddhist practice. Sometimes doing nothing is what's best.
That's a very wise statement, and we practice that a lot, right? These days, when people feel overwhelmed and there's so much to do, and everyone is trying to solve every problem at the same time, people run themselves into a wall, and they run each other into a wall, right? They might completely overdrive the organization. So this ability to sit with something, do nothing about it, understand it, accept it, embrace it, right? Look at the reality as it is, and then give the time and the space for a solution to come, all right? But it's then usually a more profound solution, often a simpler, more creative solution, rather than the action plan we would have created in the heat of the moment, right? So this wisdom to develop calmness in the eye of the storm and to provide space, as you said, for retreat, for quietness, when the world is the loudest, right? So that you can even get to a point where you realize maybe the 10 things you had planned to do initially might have created all kinds of side effects that would have created more suffering, right? And maybe the one thing then that you actually want to do once you have calmed your mind and you see clearly is a lot more impactful. And that also brings us a lot into the space of leadership, right? Buddhist philosophy does have a lot of implications for leaders. I recently read a 2019 Harvard Business Review article by the Dalai Lama, a very short piece, right? And he basically he has a very practical way of seeing things. And he says, leaders, first of all, should be selfless, mindful, and compassionate, and then they can play one of three roles where they're actually helping, right? In today's world, one is the role of the trailblazer, where a leader can pave the way and go into the face of danger to pave a way for others to go in this direction. The second one is the ferryman, who helps others to cross the river, right? And often there is a practical and symbolic piece, so you practically help others, but also you help them overcome their fear, their inner obstacles, right, their anxieties to reach a certain point. Or the leader can be a shepherd who ensures that no one gets lost, right? And I think I love this very simple way of looking at it, because it's also three very different roles, right? The trailblazer is a very, right, is more of a very active person. Buddhism sometimes is accused of being so passive, right? But when you read the Dalai Lama, the trailblazer is not a passive person, right? On the contrary, But then you also have these two very different roles, right? The ferryman and the shepherd. And I wonder what your thoughts are around leadership and Buddhism, how it helps leaders.
Hmm. Yeah, no, and that's a great question. Usually, I take this to my trainings when I have leaders. I love bringing the Buddhist perspective because it's just so helpful for them. A lot of the leaders that I encounter are excellent at everything related to their business. They know their industry, they know their strategy. Um, they can, solve problems extremely quickly. But a dimension that they often don't take into account is the dimension of people. They're leading people, right? And often um, they often ignore how complex human beings can be and how to treat people, really. Um, and I think this happens because they haven't done that inner exploration. They haven't explored their emotions that well yet. So if they haven't done the inner workings of discovering how their mind works, then, when someone is stuck, when someone has a problem, when someone is experiencing suffering, then they're unable to provide support. They also get frustrated. They also, get impatient. They might even get angry at whoever has a problem or whoever comes with a problem. Um, so through the application of Buddhism, leaders can do two things. First of all, become more self-aware and understand how their mind works, how their emotions work. And through that self-discovery, then they'll know how to lead people because they will have that extra dimension of, okay, the mind works in this way. So whenever I see this suffering manifest, then I already know how to handle it. Not only do I know how to handle it, but I'm not afraid of it. A lot of leaders I see shy away maybe from the emotional conversations. You bring in emotional pieces into the conversation and they're like, okay, let's spark that. Let's talk about, action plans. Let's talk about the business. Let's talk about, how are we going to move past this? And the emotional side of things is often overlooked. So if you remember towards the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about the fact that Buddhism starts with the acknowledgement of suffering, and that requires a lot of courage. I often see leaders overlook that. And if we start with that, if we start with that first step that Buddhism has, then we open the door for all these things, all this
Yeah. Yeah.
exploration and alleviation of suffering.
I love what you're saying, right? That the recognition first that leadership is always about people and other people and the impact we have on other human beings, right? It's never just about things. Management is about things, but leadership is about people and the impact
Exactly.
we have on others, right? And the prerequisite, and that's where neuropsychology also so corresponds with Buddhist philosophy. The prerequisite is calming our minds so that we can even be open to the needs of others, right? If we're so absorbed by ourselves, simply our empathy isn't there, right? If we're completely stressed, all the research that shows that people who are very stressed are unable to show empathy, not because they're not empathetic people, simply because their mind is fully occupied with worrying about themselves, right? So first quieting ourselves down and opening our minds to the needs, to see the true needs of others, right? And then the second point that you mentioned, and from there you go into wisdom and courage, right? This is Paul Gilbert, who very much emphasizes compassion is about wisdom and courage, right? That you have the wisdom to understand what is truly needed and helpful in this moment and the courage to act accordingly. I have a very good example when I was working with a team who was in a very difficult spot and had to make some difficult decisions, to cut some jobs. And there was literally really in this situation no other way, but they didn't want to have that conversation openly with people. They wanted to basically keep that out, drag that out as long as possible. And they were basically for themselves deluding themselves, saying that they were doing a good thing because it's good for people, they don't have to worry about it. And to get to this point of clarity that people know, right? People anyways, now you're creating a lot of rumors. There's something in the air. So what you're actually doing is you're just prolonging the suffering for people when you withhold that information. And you're more doing it because you're a coward. You're not doing it because you're actually trying to help people. You're doing it because you don't have the courage to have those conversations. And so, this realization that actually the compassionate thing to do is maybe to give a difficult truth earlier, right? Which might seem counterintuitive, rather than keeping people in the dark and telling them everything's fine, everything's okay, where you're just prolonging the suffering. And I think from that point of view, there is a lot needed, right, for leaders to get to this point of inner clarity and calmness and wisdom to then make the courageous decisions. In my work with leaders, I often find that when, for example, in coaching, they usually come with very difficult challenges that they have to deal with. Every single time they know what they need to do. They know what the right thing to do is. It's more about how do they get the inner clarity and the courage to do the right thing, right? Because usually there is something attached, there is some suffering related to it. And I'm curious, we've talked a lot about different angles now of Buddhism. We talked about why it's important, and we spoke about applications in different sectors of life. Maybe, in essence, what is your summary, and also maybe how can it help, right? Can we put it in a nutshell, and maybe we can both try, for those who are listening, what's the essence of everything we talked about?
The essence, and it's one of the most profound teachings of Buddhism, is that the idea of a separate self, the idea that we're separate from the rest, is completely illusory. It's created by the mind, and it is the only source of suffering. Because when we have this idea, then we tend to grab more than we need and push away the things that we don't want. And this creates stress in the system, and this creates a reaction from the system, and it affects us. So if we look at things through a compassion lens, if we have a compassionate mind and a compassionate intent, then we can see the connection with the system, and then we're more in harmony. So I think that's the whole point of practicing compassion from the Buddhist perspective.
I love where you're going with it, that we're all connected. Everything is connected and everyone is connected, and everything we do has an impact on everyone else, right? So this illusion of separateness, it is an illusion. I also like the very practical parts to say, first of all, let's calm our mind so that we're not a slave to the triggers, the desires, the emotions, the fears that are constantly running through our mind. Let's develop first the practices that we can calm our mind and we can see clearly. And from there, let's act with compassion, right? Which is the wisdom and courage to look at what is really the right thing to do in this point in time. And I think over time, what it allows us to develop is also a sense of inner purpose, where if we do this more often, we more and more realize what kind of challenge in the environment we are called to help with. I mean, not everyone helps with everything, right? Everyone has different strengths and a different biography and different profile. But the more often we have this point of calmness and we realize what's going on where we are, what others need, we can see things clearly and we act with wisdom and courage in those situations, the more we realize what our path asks us to do next, right? Where our path is expected to take us. And from that point of view, you're adding, I think, then a lot of value to yourself and to others, because you're finding your true inner light in a way, right? That you can shine into the world. And I've been thinking a lot recently about this topic of purpose, and I think it's often quite misunderstood. People think it's something you decide on. You have it one day and you really reflect on what's your purpose, and then you decide on a purpose. And it can become an ideology. It can become just another thing that you hang on to. You know what I mean? And it actually takes you away from tuning in and listening to yourself and tuning into others and their needs. And I have a much more evolutionary view about purpose, right? That purpose doesn't evolve magically. It's basically the more often you're able to act from a point of mindfulness, calmness, and compassion, and you attune to the needs around you, the more often you do that, naturally, you will find your purpose in doing, not in thinking, but in doing, right? So the right things. So,
Absolutely.
I do believe it has a lot of value to look at Buddhist philosophy, to practice some of the things that we talked about for ourselves and for others.
Absolutely. I think purpose emerges naturally when you practice these things. And as you, well, the Buddhist term would be as you purify the mind, but that might sound a little bit esoteric. But as you purify the mind, these things appear naturally. Purpose, compassion, all these things, what we call in Buddhism virtues, also appear in the mind. And they're extremely helpful for us and for others.
Absolutely. And maybe to close, I would like to share one of my favorite stories by Hermann Hesse, right? He's one of my favorite authors, and he has very profound and symbolic writing, right? In his novel Siddhartha, which right is very linked, obviously, to Buddhism, is a beautiful story because it's so unexpected, right? Siddhartha in his novel starts as a young person and he tries different, asceticism, he tries different things. And then he finds this very powerful spiritual teacher, right? Who is basically a Buddha. And you would think, well, great, he learns from that guy and then he just becomes a spiritual teacher. And he realizes that, there's a lot to learn from this person, but it's not his calling, so actually leaves that spiritual teacher and he does all kinds of mundane things. He becomes a merchant, he has experiences with women and all kinds of things, that are necessary in his path, to even experience life and experience different paths, even see where it takes you when you follow the material path. He wasn't ready at that time. He had to follow through with all these activities first, to see life in its fullest. And then at the end, he becomes a ferryman. He literally, sits by the river and he helps people cross the river. And obviously it's a very symbolic, from my point of view, a very symbolic message that all you can actually do is just be a ferryman then, right? If you're really a wise person, you're not teaching, you're actually just helping people to cross the river when they're ready. So it's a highly symbolic novel as well. But I think might be a nice closing for our conversation today. That sometimes things are a little bit unexpected and turn out to be different than we intuitively think.
Yeah, and also very realistic, because in spiritual practice, especially beginners tend to think that now we need to demonize everything that is mundane, and that's not true. We need to go through these experiences because they also change us.
Exactly, living in this world but not being only of this world, right? That's the key. So thanks, Maurice. This was actually a lot of fun as well, and I hope the listeners can take something out of it for themselves.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Joe. I had a lot of fun.